Hi and welcome to another gaming video, and in today's video I want to do a quick easy comparison between the original DS, the DS Lite and the DSi 3DS and the new 3DS2. So the original DS came out in 2004, had a 67 MHz processor with 4 meg of video RAM. Battery could last for 10 hours, an 850 mAh battery, it had WEP wireless and a Game Boy Advance slot. There. The DS Lite came out in 2006. It had the same 67 MHz processor and 4 meg of system RAM. It promised 15 to 19 hours of battery life on the same 850 mAh battery. It also featured WEP and a Game Boy Advance slot. The differences between the original DS and the DS Lite are screen brightness. You had more options on the DS Lite, whereas the original DS was just on or off, and the design. That is pretty much it. So if we move to the DSi, this came out in 2008 and it had a 133 MHz processor and 16 megabytes of system RAM. So twice as fast processor as the DS Lite and original DS, and 4 times the amount of system RAM. It also came with 256 meg of built-in storage, something that the other two consoles didn't have. Battery life on its 1000 mAh battery was only between 9 and 14 hours. It did feature WPA for its Wi-Fi instead of WEP, but it lost the Game Boy Advance slot. Other additions are 2 0.3 megapixel cameras and an SD card slot, and it added an additional brightness setting over the 4 that was on the DS Lite. So that's the original, the DS Lite and the DSi compared. Original and DS Lite, not a huge difference. A big jump when it goes from the DS Lite to the DSi, although as I've said in previous videos, there really wasn't much software that took advantage of the extra power. So if we move on to the 3DS, the original model was released in 2010 and it featured a 268 MHz processor. So that's a huge jump over the DSi. 128 meg of system RAM and 6 meg of video RAM. I couldn't find anywhere that gave me concise video RAM for the DSi, DS Lite and DS. The only thing I could find, and I'm not entirely sure if this is accurate, is that it had 656k of video RAM. The 3DS had 6 meg of video RAM, 1 gig internal storage, the same 0.3 megapixel cameras that the DSi had, 1300 mAh battery with a quite paltry 3 to 5 hours battery life, and it had an SD card slot. So some of the things were similar to the DSi, but the processor and the system RAM and the video RAM were seriously improved. One of the reasons I wasn't going to include the 3DS onwards is because I kind of class them as different consoles. With the DS, the DS Lite and the DSi, you could play games on all 3 systems and that was fine. But when you moved to the 3DS, you then had 3DS games, which you couldn't play on earlier consoles, but you could play DS games on a 3DS. So I'm going to include it in this little summary. If we then move up to the new 3DS, this was a massive jump. Released in 2015, featured an 804 MHz processor. That's an 804 MHz quad-core processor, whereas the original 3DS only had a dual-core and it was 268 MHz. So on pure clock speed, you're at nearly 4 times the clock speed. They doubled the system RAM to 256 meg, they increased the video RAM to 10 meg, same 1 gig internal storage, same 0.3 megapixel cameras. Battery life was increased with a 1400 mAh battery, which pushed it to sort of 6 hours, and a micro SD slot. So comparing the 3DS and the new 3DS, the processor was, should we say, 4 times as powerful, twice as much system RAM, nearly twice as much video RAM, and other than that, everything else pretty much stayed the same, other than the additional buttons that you got on the new range. So we've got 5 generations of DS consoles. So you've got the original DS, the DS Lite, the DSi, which would include the DSi XL, the original 3DS, which would include the 3DS XL and the 2DS, And then you've got the new range, which was the new 3DS, the new 3DS XL, and the new 2DS XL. And going across sort of almost 20 years, 15 years at least, you go from a 67 megahertz processor in the original model all the way up to an 804 megahertz processor in the new models. And it's great to see that my 2017 new 2DS XL can play all of the games that goes all the way back to 2004 when the original DS was released. And with each iteration of the consoles, there was some additions. So going from the DS to the DS Lite, while they had the same base hardware, there was a few little tweaks that made it different. A big jump when you went to the DSi, although not much took advantage of that. A massive leap when you went to the 3DS, so much so that they included, well, they brought a whole new game set out of them. There are games that are 2DS and 3DS only that you can't play on previous versions. And if you compare the graphics on a DS to the games on a 3DS, you will see a massive difference. There were games that were brought out for the DS and the 3DS. I noted that there was a number of Lego games. Lego Pirates of the Caribbean was released on the DS, but there was also a 3DS version, a separate game. So while you could play the DS version of Lego Pirates of the Caribbean on a 3DS, you couldn't play the 3DS version of Lego Pirates of the Caribbean on the DS. And there is some noted graphical differences between the DS version and the 3DS version. So the 3DS was a massive jump, and so I do kind of class the 3DS and the 2DS and the 3DS XL as a new generation of consoles because the games weren't backward compatible. This was a whole new hardware set. It was just fantastic that Nintendo made the 3DS backwards compatible with previous DS games. So I hope that helped. I hope that wasn't too confusing. Try to simplify it as much as possible and give you a fair comparison as we were going up in the DS stages. And there you go. I own most of those consoles that I've just said on that list. I don't own a new 3DS, but I do own a new 2DS XL. Oh, and I don't own an original 2DS. But I've got a DS, a couple of DS Lites, DSi, DSi XL, original 3DS, and a new 2DS XL. And it's great to get them all out and see how they operate and how they're different from each other and how performance is different as you go through the DS line. So there we go. Link, like, subscribe, enjoy.